you see transition back to democracy, and then unfortunately a coup fells the regime shortly after. But if you look at the series carefully, there's no pattern. There's no, at least not a pattern where you'd infer causality any which way. Now let's look at Norway. Norway achieves a rather high level of democracy. It's quoted as 100 pretty early on in the early 1900s, before it discovers and exports oil in the early 1970s, 1971 to be precise. And you see its democracy is impervious to increased fiscal reliance on oil over time. It really has no effect whatsoever. So that does it for our oil producers. Now we move on to a major producer of minerals. First, it relies on nitrates, and then very heavily on copper. It's one of the largest copper producers and exporters in the world. This is Chile. Going back to independence, we were able to push back its reliance on mineral revenues all the way back to 1818, and also graph over time its time series on its regime time. And to be honest, there really is no relationship here. You see high volatility on its fiscal reliance on copper. Despite the fact that it achieves very high levels, you see three discrete, pronounced episodes of democracy in Chile that are kind of divorced from any of the underlying patterns in its reliance on either nitrates at the beginning of its existence as a sovereign nation, and then more heavily on copper closer in time to today. So I've just showed you 6 countries that are resource producers and exporters, major resource producers and exporters. We've looked at their regime type and fiscal reliance on resource revenues over time, and we have not adduced any relationship yet. If anything, if we go back to Mexico, Venezuela, and Ecuador, there is a little bit of evidence that perhaps increased fiscal reliance on oil in all 3 countries actually maybe brought about democratization, if not supported it after democratization had occurred for some other reason. The series are moving together, or the series on fiscal reliance is preceding the increase in democratization. That's where Professor Haber and I decided to be very careful, though, and to say just because we find evidence, at least graphically, that there could be a resource blessing, not a resource curse, in certain major oil exporters, doesn't mean we should run with that evidence. Number one, because the policy implications from any study like this are big. If you think that there's a resource curse, the policy implication that flows from that is to probably not develop your resource sectors very intensely. It leads to less political rights, less economic growth, and civil war down the road. So, we subject the hypothesis that increased resource reliance over time either undermines or impedes democratization to careful statistical analysis. What we do here, I won't bore you with the details, is make sure that there are no spurious longitudinal or time series correlations between, let's say, the fiscal reliance on revenues series and the regime type series. This actually is a pitfall of any data analysis that's done over time. When 2 series move in the same direction, one could incorrectly impute causality from one series to the other. So we run a series of regressions that avoid those pitfalls by first differencing the data, that detrends the data, that makes sure that the data series are stationary, and that the basic properties of ordinary least squares regressions are respected, and that you can get infer proper causal relationships, if there are any, between the series. As you move from left to right, you'll notice Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, Nigeria, Norway, and Chile. We see here if their increased fiscal reliance over time has any impact whatsoever on their democratization. We also specify a lag structure that says that, let's say there's a permanent increase in fiscal reliance 5 years ago. What would that permanent increase in resource dependence do to a country's overall political trajectory in the long term? If you don't believe this 5-year lag structure, we experimented with several lag structures. Actually, I can remember afternoons where we tried every lag structure you can imagine from 1 to 30. And then we experimented with lag structures where you don't actually even have to define the number of lags in the past. You don't have to define how long ago there was an increase in resource dependence. It doesn't matter how you cut the data. It doesn't matter what lag structure you impose. There is no evidence in these regressions that increased fiscal reliance on resources, whether oil or minerals, over time has any impact on regime time. This is after controlling for per capita income. The results are not shown on this table, and a slew of other underlying data series that would confound the results. So these are very robust results. Okay. So if you're skeptical, though, you're saying, well, maybe there's no resource curse, maybe there's no resource blessing, even though we saw Ecuador, Mexico, and Venezuela, the two series moving pretty much commensurate with each other. What about the counterfactual exercise Professor Haber mentioned before? Well, couldn't it be that increased resource reliance over time delayed democratization or made democratization slower than it otherwise would have been under a parallel world where these countries, Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, Nigeria, Norway, and Chile, had no resources whatsoever? That's an interesting question, and it merits further investigation. So what do? We looked at paired counterfactual comparisons. Professor Haber mentioned Colombia and Venezuela. They were one country at the time of independence. They had similar political, economic, and sociological structures before Venezuela discovers oil in 1915. We actually matched every one of the countries that we've looked at over time with a paired comparison that is similar to them. And I'll actually talk about each as we look through the data, as we look through the series of polity scores for both the treatment case with oil or minerals and its control case without oil or minerals. Let's start with Ecuador and Peru, very similar on the eve of Ecuador's discovery of oil in 1971. You'll see the blue solid triangle depicts that discovery of oil, or at least where oil exports begin. And you'll see actually that Ecuador and Peru track each other quite similarly in terms of their political trajectory over time since independence. This is especially true after Ecuador discovers oil. They're forecasting doubt that a counterfactual Ecuador without oil would have experienced any different of a political trajectory and any different of a democratization experience. Let's look at Venezuela and Colombia, the first compared comparison Professor Haber mentioned. Again, after Venezuela begins to export oil to a large degree, you see Colombia and Venezuela pretty much track each other in terms of their political trajectory, in terms of their regime type post the discovery and export of oil in Venezuela. Mexico and Brazil, another case of a paired comparison where Brazil and Mexico had similar political institutions, similar economic institutions, and are not identical, but at least a similar colonial experiences in a similar sociological or demographic characteristics. You see, again, a tracking of each other's political trajectory over time, especially after Mexico's second oil boom, as you can see by the darkened blue triangle, that begins in around 1973-74. Nigeria and Tanzania, interestingly enough, track each other rather well beginning in the early 60s. And before that, you actually see, I think there's a mistake with this graph. What? Because the years stop and then start again.
Yes.
No, it's that they run together. Oh, yeah, there is.
Okay, let's skip over that for now. Trust me, though.
When they usually it's something got screwed up on the number, the years got screwed up, but the data series are right.
Okay, the years.
It's just somehow. Somebody was smoking marijuana.
Oh no, it was Excel.
Let's blame it on Bill Gates and his monopoly. We'll blame it on Excel.
Okay.
But
anyways, if you can imagine an x-axis where the years are seamless and follow the right order, calendar order, you see pretty much a parallel political trajectory, especially after